I'm Inoy Araceli Brown. I am on Facebook at the Open Center, and I'm your host today. The Open Center is getting ready for a new season. Presentations coming up for next year, so please visit our website at www.opencenter.org and keep up to date with the new offerings. Always send us some feedback and suggestions. An additional note, we are having a fundraiser. It's called 12 Days of Gratitude coming up in December. Going from December 1st through December the 12th, and there will be different experiences every night at 7 p.m. with a different presenter, and it's free of charge. We, of course, would love donations, and they're all welcomed. And please watch for upcoming details. Now, I would like to introduce Faith Adiale. She is the daughter of a Nordic American mother, Scandinavian, Nigerian father, and Faith was raised as the only Black girl in a small farming community in Washington state. Her father left and returned to Nigeria when she was just a toddler. She is the graduate at Harvard University. She is the author of two memoirs, The Nigerian-Nordic Girl's Guide to Lady Problems, a witty tricultural audiobook about Black women and fibroids. Okay. And her other memoir, Meeting Faith, a travel memoir about becoming Thailand's first Black Buddhist nun. And she won the PEN Award for Best Memoir for that. She is the founder of Bona Travel, the nation's first workshop for travel writers of color, an African book club at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. And she's the recipient of UNESCO's International Artist, I'm gonna have to say this right, Bursary and Millennium Award for Creative Nonfiction. She's lived in West Africa, Southeast Asia, worked as a diversity trainer, community activist. She taught travel writing, memoir from Bali, Ghana to Switzerland. And she's been one of Marie Claire's magazine's 5 Women to Learn From. So be aware of that. And she's been featured in O Magazine, Huffington Post, Pink Magazine, and just getting to the end here, produced a PBS documentary called My Journey Home. The records her journey to Nigeria to reunite her with her father and siblings. She's currently working on a memoir, Twins, Growing Up Nigerian, Scandinavian, American, and discusses her multicultural background, her childhood, and her reunion with her father. She is also writing the scripts for A World of Calm, a new series co-produced on HBO Max, just started in October of 2020, with narrations from Idris Elba, Nicole Kidman, Kate Winslet, and many others. Faith lives in Oakland. And so I think that'll be all for today. We have a lot here.
Can we just go home now?
Yeah. So welcome, Faith. Lovely to have you here. You were a find for me because I was looking and saying, I want a woman of color who's brilliant. And I went through like 20, 30 people and I went, she's the one I want to have come to the Open Center. I'm like, this is great. Now, I want to describe something about you. It says your relationship with your mother and grandparents. Your first training was in the arts and activism, meaning that you were aware that meaning you were questioning everything. You put yourself on the line, but to do it beautifully and keep them laughing. Hence the title of your class with us, How to Write Memoir and Still Be Invited to Family Thanksgiving. We love this. Now, is this your approach to writing and life? How has a sense of humor served you being biracial and a woman writer?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a joy being discovered by you and talking about
Hardly.
what we can do
For
and
us,
how we
yes.
can make teaching exciting online too. So this has been really fun. I love, having to adapt what I do to new challenges. And humor is a great way. I mean, I've always been, I believe that reading saved my life, writing saved my life, and it can do that for other people. So I think, the arts are incredibly important. However,
Yeah.
and I want to deal with like really big topics, but I'm always thinking about how to make it approachable for people. What makes people want to change? And I learned this also when I was doing diversity training. People change and take risks when they feel good. And so part of that is, you know, things happen to me, and yet when I'm telling the story later, I'm always telling it in a funny way, and that's unintentional. And so I just love that. I love the tragic comic because I think that's what life is. Even if we deal with really heavy things, we're not just victims. We find ways to be resilient and to find humor and to kind of have some agency in telling our stories. And I came from a family. My grandfather, my Swedish grandfather, was always telling dramatic tall tales that were like hilarious, and you couldn't really trust them, but I always took them at face value. Um, my grandmother was more sensitive, but she also had a great sense of humor. My mom and I crack up all the time. My husband is hilarious. And I just thought about, like, in the things I want to do, actually actively cultivating the humorous, informal storytelling aspects into larger issues just makes it easier for you to address as a writer, and also for the reader. So it's,
Okay.
yeah, it just shows our nuances.
Well, this is important. Now your was it Meeting Faith, your memoir? It chronicles the decision you made to become a Buddhist nun in Thailand,
Hmm.
which is kind of like what? Um,
Exactly.
I mean,
It's
this is
totally like
important
that.
because it's like, where did this come from? I mean, you're in the middle of Harvard University, and you're going to school, and basically you're having trouble with all these dichotomies about being part white, part black. Do I fit in with other Black fellow students at Harvard? Um, I don't stand up to the white beauty standard. All of this alienation. And
Mm.
then you decide, okay, I'm going to go and you're going into the next step of your life. But that was quite a deep dive. Now, the thing about memoir is, how, if not to get stuck in genre expectations,
Mm.
how do you teach memoir? Are there techniques that raise the writing to another level? Because you'll say, oh, it's a memoir class, I know what it's like, I know what to do, I just need practice, or something like that. But coming from you, that's a whole other thing, that's a whole other being.
Right, right. Um, and I think for me, I mean, the thing that I love about memoir is it's making meaning out of memory. And oftentimes I don't really know what the significance of an event was, or why I'm haunted by a particular memory. And so by writing it, I get, all this kind of clarity. And then also the personal then becomes in service of something larger. And so I never thought that I would write about being a Buddhist nun. For me, initially, that was a narrative of failure. I had, like, you know, made my family proud by getting a scholarship to Harvard. I was the first person in my school, and I was the little Black girl who did it. So I was like, stakes were so high. And when I couldn't deal, I felt like I completely failed as a human being. I didn't have the language for what had happened to me. I essentially had a breakdown, got in bed, pulled my covers over my head and just flunked out. I did not know what had happened and what to do about it. And I really blamed myself. And so then, in kind of going to Thailand and putting myself back together through this unlikely path of ordaining as a Buddhist nun, I still didn't see that that had been a great success, or that was a story that was useful for anyone. So I never really told it. It took years before, I mean, I would
Ah,
mention it occasionally. It was an oral story of, like, oh, at one time I did this wacky thing. And it took me a long time to realize it could be the stuff of literature. And I think that's often the case when we feel shame, when we feel like it's highly personalized. I mean, here I'm this, like, Nigerian-Nordic girl. So who's my base anyway? And then I
uh,
did this, like, Buddhist nun thing. And so I just felt like nobody could relate to this story. America already tells me that I'm not really, the norm. So deciding to write it and thinking, okay, what are the themes that people would actually be interested in, that could be universal, that people could connect to? How do we recover from failure? How do we change our lives? What is the connection between bravery and spirituality and political engagement and all these things that are kind of siloed in the West? How can we integrate them? And so by revisiting the site of failure to think about what was the story and the themes, I saw that it actually was a recovery narrative, and that there were things that, even though the specifics were unique to me, the themes were universal and people could connect to. And so that's what I do when I take students through writing. It's like, what are the specific granular details that will make the story come to life on the page? And then, so we're going internally, but we're also moving externally to the larger themes that other people can connect to and say, okay, so I'm not a biracial Buddhist nun, but I know what it's like to feel like you've let everybody down and I don't know how I'm going to put myself back together.
That's very good. I mean, one of the things I always wonder when you enter a memoir class is, I think, of course, memory. And I think, well, I've not been journaling all my life. So I imagine you were a nun and you were journaling away every day so that one day you'd have these notes. I mean, were you?
I was journaling every day. I didn't think I was going to share the notes.
Okay, there we go. Because it is something that people worry about, because like, I can't rely on my I'm on memory, and am I going to have a good enough story, and how is this going to work?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that you are giving them certain types of skills or ways of either waking up memory or going beyond, so that that actually becomes some sort of learning lesson. I mean, most stories are flat when the way you remember them.
Right.
But once they hit the page, I'm assuming it becomes three-dimensional, and you're able to assist in that process.
Exactly. And I'm not a great journaler. I mean, the ironic thing is that I've only kept like 3 journals in my life, and I only wrote the nun story because someone was asking me. Norton was putting together an anthology of Black women's journals, and so I had 3 journals. So I sent my first journal, and they were like, "This is great, but not what we needed. Do you have something else?" So I sent my second journal, and they're like, "This is great, but not what we needed." And I'm like, "What am I going to do? The only other journal I have is when I was a Buddhist nun, and that's like wacky." And they're like, "Faith, why did you not lead with that?" And so I sent the journals. They were excerpted in this anthology, and then Ms. Magazine wanted to highlight the anthology, and they chose my story. And so there was a photo of me and Ms. with some of the journals, and I started getting fan letters. And then I was like, oh, there's a story here. So it's ironic because I'm not a journaler. But I have all these techniques to help us recover memory, and then also analyze memory to figure out what is the story. Why does the memory bubble up? Why does it want to be told? And so I do a lot of stuff that's based in the body, that's based in using the senses. That comes out of Buddhism, kind of the sense memory and the gateways to the senses, and ways to bypass the critical mind. Because I think some of the things that mean the most to us, we carry in sound, we carry in our stomachs, we carry in all of these places. And so I do these things to help you bypass the critical mind that says, oh, that's not the stuff of literature, or that's not the stories we tell, or who would want to know that, and kind of just allow the story to emerge organically from your body. And then we go back and look at it and say, okay, what are the really cool textural things we can pull out here, and then start to dramatize it, and like bring out the characters, bring out the setting, highlight the theme, really make it come to life so that it's, resonating on the page. I love teaching memoir because everybody has at least one great personal story, and I have the techniques to make it really work on the page for you.
Well, this is important, because one of the things I wondered is, because I was assuming, she went over there and she went, I got to go home now and write to this book. And besides, when you left, you were there for 2 years. I mean, you had a shaved head, shaved eyebrows. You were eating 1 meal a day. You were sleeping 4 hours a day. You were meditating 19 hours a day. I'm thinking, when did she get time to actually do a journal? And then you ran back to Harvard and you graduated, but you were now, I would assume at some point, if you hadn't written this, would you consider it to have been a complete experience? Did the writing of the memoir complete the experience for you?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, because prior to writing it, I just thought it had been this like wacky detour where I went astray. like I didn't complete college on time. I failed. I like went somewhere. It was really fun. I enjoyed doing what I was doing, but it just felt like a detour in terms of the narrative that I was supposed to be following. And I wasn't quite sure why I had done it. I knew that I felt stronger when I returned. And a lot of it was I had the strength to kind of change the narrative because, it was the external identities that were projected onto me that kind of led me to fall apart. And when I came
Right.
back, I had put myself back together from the inside out. And so I could kind of, I had this renewed purpose and I was like, I'm not going to participate in things that don't work for me. So I felt really strong, but I didn't really know what the narrative had been. And so it's when I did go back to those journals, I typed all the journals up and I read through them and I'm like, who is this girl? She's like vulnerable, but she's fearless and she's trying this stuff that I wouldn't try. And how
Wow.
is she meditating for so long? I mean, it was really like meeting another character.
Wow.
And I'm like, and what made her do it? Because she was terrified. Like she didn't know anything about religion. She didn't know anything about Buddhism. She got to the temple and it was super hard. Like, why did she agree to do it? And that's what everyone always asks, like, why did you do it? And so in having to kind of figure out that character's motivation, i.e. me, then I saw all these connections to how I'd been raised and how like my parents' commitment to civil rights and my grandparents' commitment to the labor movement, and that all of these things that I thought were political struggles were actually preparing me for this spiritual struggle. And so I learned a lot about myself and how it wasn't a detour. It actually made sense with the values that I'd been raised in. And that did, in fact, complete the experience because then it was part of my narrative and it made sense and it was something I was proud of. And I begin every one of like, I teach at a college and I introduce myself the first day as I'm someone who flunked out of college and now I'm your professor. And how did that happen? What's the narrative in between? And so being able to share that vulnerability, I think is really helpful in what I do now.
Wow. I mean, you mastered some lessons there because of this completion. And that is an important point, I think, about writing in general and just the writing that you have come to teach. Now, I mean, I see writing sometimes as something that has to do, when you write about your life, it has to be something where without judgment.
Mm,
And it also
yeah.
has to have the purpose of the memoir, I'm assuming, has to have a compassionate view of the experience.
Mm,
So it can take several views from that situation to different people, and those people have different mindsets, so they can all put themselves in your shoes. They can
right.
see themselves in your shoes. They
Yeah.
can learn about you and themselves. And is that
Mhm.
been your experience?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the beauty because I mean, writing is so solitary, and you're just wrestling with the page. You're like, does anyone care? And do I
Mhm.
have the skills to do this? And like, um, the actual title, the working title of my book, when I was writing, it was called Why Anyone Other Than My Mother Would Want to Buy This Book. I mean, when I have a block, I like to just name it up front and just kind of
Okay.
write towards that. And so eventually, after a while, I was like, yes, someone other than my mom would want to read this. So it really kind of helped me figure out what I wanted to say to people. But it's still solitary. You're just imagining that there will be
Right.
an audience there. And then when it comes out and people come to you and tell you how they connected to it, it's an incredible gift. It's so exciting. And it's not necessarily the people that you think it's going to be. And so I remember one of the most profound moments for me, and I wrote a little, so the story talks a little bit about my upbringing. And so part of it was, not knowing my father, being raised by my mother, and then later meeting him, and and using meditation to kind of get over a lot of fears I had about abandonment and anger and just kind of all this stuff. And I remember giving a talk somewhere, and this young man, military guy, dressed head to toe in camo, head shaved, comes running down the aisle of this big auditorium, and he's waving my book, and it's got like drawings and X's on it and stuff like that. And I was like, oh my God, like what is going to
What is
happen?
he
And
going to
he's
do to
like,
me?
I have to talk to you. And I'm like, so like all of my biases and prejudices kick in, and I'm like, oh, what is going to happen? And he says, is it true that meditating can help you overcome fear and anger? Because I'm shipping out tomorrow to active duty and I'm a captain and I want to treat my soldiers with intention. And if we meditate together, will that make me a better captain and help us
Wow.
overcome our fears? I mean, that was like the
That
best
was,
response to my book I have ever received.
that is so, you influenced an entire life in a maybe platoon. I don't know what
Right?
they're called. No,
Yeah.
this is, I mean, so far you're quite amazing. And you talk about traveling the globe and teaching through writing, but you identify yourself as a memoirist and also as a travel writer.
Mhm.
Now, how significant is travel to writing for you? Is it just a physical travel, or do you mean travel in other kinds?
Mm. Ooh, great questions. Wow. We should do this all the time. Yeah, that's a super great question. For me, I'm defining travel really broadly, and there were a couple of things that I was trying to do. One, I felt that travel literature um, has incredible potential for kind of global understanding and transformation, but it's been horribly segregated, and it's been like kind of an extension of colonialism. It's, when you see who gets in best American travel writing, and if you see who, gets in these gigs and stuff like that, it was very, very segregated part of society. It was like really, it was all about leisure travel. It was all about people from the West or the Northern Hemisphere going to the Southern Hemisphere, having these expectations of authenticity. Often the location and the locals were just kind of a backdrop for like a Western coming of age, sort of
Yeah.
drama. I mean, it just felt really, really problematic. And yet it had the potential, because it's international, possibly, to really change hearts and minds. So at a certain point, I was like, I'm just going to, it was before people were talking about decolonizing, but I was like, I wanted essentially decolonize this genre. And I felt like travel had been such a part of my family narrative. I mean, my grandparents immigrating from Finland and Sweden and becoming American, and particularly becoming white American, and then my Nigerian father coming as an international student. And then the changes, the seismic psychic travels that were happening during the civil rights movement that brought my parents together. And then my father returning back to kind of fight for freedom and for, decolonizing, for independence in Africa. And so I thought, well, those are all travels, those are all movements, but we don't call them that. And then I just thought about like travel is psychic, like, a spiritual journey is very much like a traditional journey. You have kind of this crisis, you leave home, you wander through the dark night of the soul, and you return to changed person. I'm like, the very first stories, Odyssey and the Iliad, were travel stories, but they were also spiritual stories. And I felt that a lot of things that my friends as first generation or people of color or people who are in recovery, those are all journeys as well. I know for me as a scholarship student, one of the most difficult cross-cultural exchanges for me was like leaving the farm and going to an elite new school in New England. And that was a journey. And why isn't that honored as a journey? I had to do all sorts of cultural negotiation as well as moving physically. So I'm really interested in travel as both a kind of a metaphor for a kind of a psychic encountering as well as physically moving through space. And so I just really kind of wanted to change how we talk about it and who gets to be involved in travel narratives.
Wow, this is a really good point, because not most people will not take that apart to really you expand it, the
Yeah.
meaning. So the other point is I want to really read something here, your definition of memoir. Memoir, the intersection between story and reflection. What I love about memoir is that it democratizes storytelling. I put a Q in there. Official history of the world is penned by power brokers, but the real stories are lived on the ground by ordinary people. Memoir is the ultimate civil act. How does that apply to anyone who writes when you say that?
How does it apply? I mean, one of the
I
things
see how it applies to you, but
now it applies to all of us. I mean, so I got involved in memoir back before it was like the super popular thing it is now. And so, but I mean, there were people before that. I mean, it used to be that you had to be like, a retired president who would pen your memoirs,
yeah,
And I think Maya Angelou was one of the first people who just like made a name for herself, just being an ordinary person writing incredibly beautiful stuff. And when I finally came upon Memoir, which was by accident, yeah, I'd been a poet prior to that. Um, I was just like, this is amazing, because I was coming out of doing activist work, working with international groups to do kind of social change work. And I realized that whenever we had to make a big decision by consensus, people would kind of tell a narrative about themselves. They would do this talk story of, this is who I am, these are my people, this is where I come from, and this is what matters to us, before they would engage in these conversations. And I was like, oh, personal narrative is like, it's the jam. It's like how we live in the world. It's how we define what matters to our people. It's what we're bringing to the table, and it's how we encounter each other. It's not something frivolous. It's not divorced from community building or from anything we're doing. And it really, I also saw how people had been really harmed by this national narrative we have of what it is to be American, what it is to be a success, all of kind of these stereotypes that we expect we need to live into. And I was like, the master narrative can really create harm. And we know that history is penned by the victors, but there are all these interesting things that are going on in the, on the ground. And I also saw in my own family, everything, like all these larger connections, all these larger things happening in the world had shaped our family. The third great migration from Europe, African independence, the civil rights. Like, so you can't divorce history from individuals and families. And so I was like, let's just do it a different way. Start with the family and then use that as a way to read history. And I saw that as Memoir became popular, people were poo-pooing it and saying, oh, that's just women navel gazing. And I was like, actually, it's potentially really powerful because it's upending like all of the power structures and saying, wait, what happened in my local community and what happened in my body and what happened in my family is part of the larger narrative, and it matters. So I really try to get people to think about that, because there's not one narrative, there are many, and it's only by all of us sharing them that we'll get the full kind of nuances of what's going on. And it's very clear that we're living in a historic moment right now. 2020 is so historic, and we all need to be journaling and telling our stories about our
now you tell me
part of it.
Well, what if someone says to you, well, I led an uneventful life, or you have the other person says, I've led a horrible life. Do the skills you teach help people to think outside the box and give them these safety guidelines to approach like hard subject matter, or find the jewel in their remembrance of their life, or, that they think was uneventful?
Yeah. Those are okay. So those are actually two questions, two great questions. Like oftentimes when I'm teaching personal narrative, which can be travel, personal essay, memoir, particularly in the classroom. So I'll have 20-year-old students, and a lot of them say like, oh, I'm just an ordinary white middle-class person. I don't have a memoir and I just lived a regular life. And I'm like, well, first of all, let's take those words apart of deciding what the norm is. But there's also a way in which for a while then people thought, oh, I have to have lived through an incredible amount of trauma, or I have to be interesting as in a diverse multicultural way. And they weren't acknowledging that we all have culture. Even if you're just an ordinary white person, that's a culture that you need to be documenting and thinking about. But we all have culture, come from family cultures, community cultures. Even if our family came here and got involved in kind of amnesia and didn't talk about what happened, and you don't know where you came from or anything like that, there's still stuff there. So some of it is my techniques of helping everybody realize that they have this unique culture and that we could all write the same story, and it's all going to be different because we're placed differently. We look at things differently. We make meaning in a different way. So I have exercises where we all take a different approach. And so you see kind of what is interesting there about everybody's story. And part of it is just your voice. You might have a really humorous way of looking at something, and you're telling a tiny story of like going to the store to buy a popsicle, but it's like hilarious, and it's embedded in kind of what your neighborhood was like and what were the popsicles and how your mom talked to you and stuff. And so, with craft and voice, we can make a lot of things we like about memoir is the past coming back to us, like, oh my God, I had that toy. Oh my God, I haven't thought about that forever. So a lot of times those specific details can be really, really joyful. It doesn't have to be traumatic. Of course, lots of traumatic things often do emerge. And I have ways for, kind of how to deal with that. I just gave a talk about this yesterday, I think, and how sometimes you feel like sometimes when I was writing, I felt like I was going to die if I had to go back and revisit something. I mean, I
Okay.
just really felt like, and a lot of times those things are based on shame, and shame doesn't make sense. Like there were things I'm ashamed of because I did. And then there are shames that I inherited, which aren't real. Like I feel shame because I didn't have a father growing up. I feel shame because I was poor. Well, I didn't do anything wrong, but those are really, really powerful and they really survive in the shadows. And so
Yeah.
bringing them out and writing about them feels hard at the time, but then you have this, you're the puppet master, you have this agency, you're creating the story and you see, I've actually already survived. I've survived enough that I can actually tell the story. And so, and then you create it on the page so that it has an impact on other people. And they're like, oh, I felt that too. And now I feel less alone. And so there's this kind of wonderful catharsis. I don't say write memoir for catharsis, but it's this kind of wonderful side effect that happens when you're ready to look at it.
Ah, okay. Because this brings me to you had a quote from Toni Morrison. And it's basically about in times of turmoil, she says, this is precisely the time when artists go to work. Now, is that because the creative mind comes alive, your mind is crystal clear, you're living in the moment, your memory is now vivid and it gives you direction where to go? I mean, what's
That would be great.
no, huh?
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, one, there's been a lot of talk about how like artists are first responders, and we're not in the sense of, you know, medical folks who are like working day to day without PPE and, people who are harvesting our food and putting themselves at risk. We're not in that sense. But when crises happen, we look to the arts to make sense of it. We're really, we're looking to the poets and the writers and, filmmakers and be like, what is this? Like, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us as a people? And we might underfund the arts at other times of the year. But when
Yeah.
these things happen, we're like, who is telling us what's going on, And
Mhm.
so we really need that, the arts to we need the artists to like be putting out their feelers and, kind of experience these things through the sense organs and then making sense and saying, this has happened before and this is how we lived through it. This is what these are the stories that we're hearing now. These are the metaphors because we actually process these things in metaphor to explain what's happening to us. And so it's the artist is really kind of venturing out into the world, um, and then coming back and reporting the news essentially in a way that, news is so kind of problematic, right? There's like no kind of human element to
It's
it.
kind of one-dimensional, yeah.
Right, it's very, very one-dimensional. It makes you feel really bad, so then you just wanna kind of turn away from it and stuff like that. It's just telling you the what, but it's not telling you
Facts.
the why or the
Right.
who, the things that really matter. And so it's the artist, it's the writers, it's the poet that are getting the human element of why did it happen and the metaphor of what does it relate to and how can we become better humans still while encountering this trauma. Um, and so initially, when the lockdown happened, I couldn't think of any. I just felt like I didn't have anything to write. I just felt really, really stuck. Um, and then a friend and I started this weekly writing group for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Just we would come together for 2 hours every Monday and we would have writing prompts. And it was like, just try to do something that was just focused, just a tiny prompt, just because this is too much. So let's just think about one tiny thing. And then having to craft these prompts for people, I realized that there were just so many amazing stories out there, things that were happening. And I just had a language to start to write about them. And then I was like, Toni was right. Like, I mean, Toni's always right, but she was right. Like, this is the moment. There's so much richness to get to work.
Excellent, excellent. Now, do we best understand truth about ourselves and the world through self-reflection? That is our tool, isn't it?
It is our tool, right? Right.
So that is also a healing tool. And I'm assuming, of course, by the conversation we've already had, you've gone through different types and different levels of healing through writing your
Mm.
work. Now, so all the things you've lived through when you were younger, of course, that you felt kept you down, and now that you work with the written word, what has the writing done for your soul?
Mm. Oh wow, that's so beautiful. Um, I mean, I think, identity was a big issue for me growing up. Um, being raised by a white mom, uh, you know, on a farm with Nordic grandparents, and not really knowing how my blackness fit in, and then my blackness coming from Nigeria and not the United States. And then once I left the farm, and people read me as Black American or the term African American, um, and then having it took a lot for me to, you know, claim being Black, claim being biracial and multiracial, claim being Nigerian, learning all of these things. And so a lot of it was, and then kind of the recovery narrative as well. A lot of that thinking happened in the writing. And so oftentimes you write because you feel alone. You feel like, I don't know where to put these feelings, and I don't know who to talk about it with. And so it was really interesting. Like PBS did a documentary about me finding my family. I started to write these essays about kind of not really knowing what I was. And people showed up, people responded, people said, oh, I feel that way too. And all of a sudden I had a tribe of people who felt the same thing. And also in writing it, I could kind of write what I wanted. I kind of felt like I wrote myself into wholeness, just very similar to what happened in the temple through meditation and kind of putting myself back together. And so I feel whenever I see my writing as a series of inquiries and problems that will be resolved through the writing. And once I have the language for it, then I can actually move through the world and say like, oh, I'm not engaging with that. Oh, I'm rejecting that. Oh, I actually am doing this and that. So the writing is the space for it to happen. Yeah, the imagined psychic space and the linguistic space that then allows me to do it. Another great thing about writing memoir is that, none of us are an island, so you have to write about family members, which can be fraught, but you have to make them into real characters on the page. So when I think about my parents, who are these beings that have this power over me, but when I have to create them on the page with both their vulnerabilities and their strengths, with their heroism and their weaknesses, so that you, the reader, can understand them, then I start to understand them, and I understand the motivations and what they did. And I kind of fell in love with my parents, and I understood them, and it healed a lot of psychic wounds, because I was like, well, of course, I understand why they're doing this,
Now you're compassionate.
Right, exactly. And it
lacking
was
judgment.
because the craft required it. The craft required me to make them full characters, round characters. And so then I understood them. And so that's a great
beautiful
side effect.
I mean, this is amazing. I've actually learned a lot. So Faith Adiale is going to be online with the Open Center on Saturday and Sunday, November the 21st and 22nd. And she's just going to do that from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. And of course, I just love to see that in the AM morning. So, and then she will be asking things like, have your notebook, because you're going to get homework for one night. And definitely how to write memoir and still be invited to family Thanksgiving. At the end, right now, we're coming to the end. You'll see something where you can go and register. So Faith Adiale, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. That was lovely.
Really lovely.
I'll see you later.
Okay.
Bye.